With each passing week, more and more people are being arrested and prosecuted for hate crimes. As such, it's actually quite important for people to understand what constitutes a hate crime and how the police go about investigating such crimes. The first thing I want to make clear about the term hate crime is that it is an emotive and politicised term, which is actually rather imprecise and not legally defined. And as I go further into explaining how hate crimes are investigated, you will see just how serious this issue is. The term hate crime was obviously coined for several reasons. One of them was to create a two-tier legal system. One tier of this new legal system deals with less serious offences, simply known as crimes, and the other tier deals with more serious Soviet-style political offences known as hate crimes. Because if someone walks up to you and stabs you 32 times in the chest because they just wanted to, that's now less of a crime than if someone walks up to you and stabs you 32 times in the chest because they were motivated by hate. What's more, if somebody walks up to you and stabs you 32 times in the chest because they just wanted to, that might now be a less serious crime than someone walking up to you and punching you on the nose if the person throwing that punch was motivated by hate. You see, once a crime is deemed a hate crime, it must be investigated more vigorously and punished more harshly, despite the fact that the actual quantifiable damage caused to the victim might not in fact be as serious as the quantifiable damage caused by another more heinous crime that wasn't motivated by hate. And there is now a diktat from the Home Office stating that the investigation of hate crimes must be prioritised over the investigation of other crimes. And of course, hate is being used as a tool by politically correct thinkers. In this case, politically correct thinkers at the British College of Policing. And these people have come up with what they call the 5 monitored strands of hate crime. And essentially, these monitored strands are brackets which a hate crime can fall into. And they are 1. Disability, 2. Race, 3. Religion, 4. Sexual orientation, 5. Transgender. I believe they are listed in alphabetical order, as listing them in importance may be construed as a hate crime in itself by some. Now, I took this information from the British College of Policing's document titled Hate Crime Operational Guidance. As always, it's linked in the description below, and this is one document that all nationalists in the UK want to download and digest, so you get a full grasp of how crime and policing have been politicised. And as you will soon see, policing these so-called hate crimes is very subjective rather than objective. The first worrying thing to take from this document is the following, and I quote, "There is no criminological consensus on the definition or even the validity of the concept of hate crime, but it is important that this policy has a framework." End quote. And yes, you did hear that correctly. There is no consensus on either the definition or the concept of a hate crime. Yet despite how inconclusive the first part of that sentence was, the sentence concludes that there must be a framework for dealing with hate crime, despite hate crime not even being properly defined or even considered valid by some legal experts. At this point, if I hadn't provided the link to the document this comes from, many people would actually think that this was too insane to be real. But prepare to go down the rabbit hole even further, as it all gets much worse. The Hate Crime Operational Guidance then goes on to state, and I quote, "Hate crimes and incidents are taken to mean any crime or incident where the perpetrator's hostility or prejudice against an identifiable group of people is a factor in determining who is victimized." End quote. So the first thing to note is there are 2 different groupings here, a hate crime and a hate incident. Both are defined in a very similar manner. However, a hate incident is, and again I quote from the document, a non-crime incident that is motivated by the perpetrator's hostility or prejudice against an identifiable group of people, end quote. And that in itself sets a very worrying precedent. The police are investigating and cataloguing non-crime incidents based on perceived prejudices, which then goes on to beg the question, where is that information stored and who has access to it? In layman's terms, people who haven't broken the law but may have said something the state deems politically incorrect are now being placed on police databases, so presumably the state can monitor them. And this can have a real-world effect. Anyone subject to a CRB check for employment is likely to be turned down for their application if they were found to be on one of these lists. The second thing to note is that all of this rests on proving the perpetrator's hostility or prejudice towards someone based on either disability, race, religion, sexual orientation, or transgender issues. That in itself is a very grey area. How can one truly understand a person's motivations and prove those motivations beyond reasonable doubt? Is it always possible to know someone's motivation? Are these motivations thoroughly investigated? Are those accused subject to background checks? Does the accuser have to back up their assertion with facts? Does the individual being accused have a chance to defend themselves against such allegations? Well, the British College of Policing begins to lay out how they will deal with the issue of proving prejudice or hostility in their definition of a hate crime, which is, and I quote, "A hate crime is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by a hostility or prejudice based on a person's race or perceived race, or a hostility or prejudice based on a person's religion or perceived religion, or a hostility or prejudice based on a person's sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, or a hostility or prejudice based on a person's disability or perceived disability, or a hostility or prejudice against a person who is transgender or perceived to be transgender." End quote. And there you have it. A hate crime is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by a hostility or prejudice towards another person based on one of the 5 aforementioned categories that the police currently monitor. So there is no actual solid definition from the police of what constitutes a hate crime. It all falls down to the perception of the victim, or in fact, any other person. And that other person doesn't have to be an onlooker or even be present when the alleged incident takes place. They can simply have heard or read of the alleged incident and interpreted said incident as being motivated by hate and contacted the police to tell them so. Quite simply, if someone sees or hears of you committing an alleged crime or an incident and believes that alleged crime or incident to be motivated by hate, then you have, according to the British police, committed a hate crime or a hate incident. The police don't define this. The alleged victim or any other person who may or may not have viewed what occurred defines whether it is a hate crime or a hate incident based on their own personal and highly subjective perceptions. And if you think I am joking or taking this out of context or misinterpreting the document for my own ends, I will read you exactly what the document in question has to say about this. And I quote, "For recording purposes, the perception of the victim or any other person is the defining factor in determining whether an incident is a hate incident or in recognizing the hostility element of a hate crime. The victim does not have to justify or provide evidence of their belief, and police officers or staff should not directly challenge this perception. Evidence of the hostility is not required for an incident or crime to be recorded as a hate crime or hate incident. Crimes and incidents must be correctly recorded if the police are to meet the objective of reducing underreporting and improve understanding of the nature of hate crime. The alleged actions of the perpetrator must amount to a crime under normal crime recording rules. If this is the case, the perception of the victim or any other person will decide whether the crime is recorded as a hate crime. If the facts do not identify any recordable crime, but the victim perceived it to be a hate crime, the circumstances should be recorded as a non-crime hate incident and not a hate crime. It is necessary to provide sufficient evidence for the prosecution to prove hostility to the court for a conviction to receive enhanced sentencing. However, this is not required for recording purposes. End quote. So when an incident occurs, whether it is recorded and investigated as a hate crime or a hate incident, is based on the perception of the victim or any other person who may or may not have witnessed it. So if you see someone shoving another person in the street and report it to the police as a hate crime without having any evidence of such or even knowing the context of what is going on, the police have to record that incident as a hate crime. But the document goes further. If the victim of an alleged hate crime reports that crime as a hate crime, not only do they not have to justify or provide any evidence to back up that assertion, police officers or staff are not allowed to challenge this. So here we have a set of guidelines that do not require the person who reports a so-called hate crime to provide any evidence to the police to back up their claims. And regardless of how ridiculous or far-fetched those claims may be, the police are not allowed to question them. And even if the evidence of the alleged crime, not the motivation, but the actual criminal act, points to the fact that no actual crime has been committed, the police still record the occurrence as a hate incident, and the accused is still put on a police database because someone else regarded them to be motivated by hate without having to provide any evidence whatsoever to back up that assertion. The politically correct commissars are crafting a Soviet-style legal system that isn't based on fact, a legal system that isn't based on reasoned evidence, and are actually going down a direction that seems at odds with the age-old English legal foundation of innocent until proven guilty. This new legal system will not be objective, and the rules of this legal system will not be directly quantifiable. This legal system will be subjective and defined by any individual and their personal interpretation of an event or incident. This new legal system won't be based on facts, but on feelings, and the police officers investigating incidents or crimes won't be allowed to challenge those feelings or demand facts to back them up. What's more, even those who haven't been proven guilty, those who haven't committed a crime, will have their details recorded. They will be added to a register of those who have been accused by others of hating. This legal system will create a new crime, a crime of being motivated by hate, and that crime will be punishable to a greater level than regular crimes, to the point where even those accused of such things will be added to a database and presumably be monitored in some way by the state. All of this might sound like part of a plot from a dystopian novel, but it is not. This is sadly the reality of living in modern-day Britain. Facts are replacing feelings. Feelings cannot be challenged. Those accused of being motivated by hate are presumed guilty, and even if they are found innocent, they are put onto government lists. This isn't justice. This is Soviet-style tyranny and the end of the rule of law. This is the tyranny of the multicultural, politically correct, liberal system in which we live. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.